Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here in Armidale for our community forum on Is the New England Renewable Energy Zone Broken? My name is Gerard Holland and I have the absolute privilege of being your MC this evening. I am a blow-in. I grew up on a farm just outside of Greenthorpe in the Riverina and now live in Bathurst with my wife. But the issues that we're going to be talking about today are affecting us all over the countryside, all across New South Wales and all across the nation. I also happen to be the CEO of the Page Research Centre. Now, the Page Research Centre is an organisation that is dedicated to better policy and outcomes for regional and rural Australia. We are firmly of the belief that with Australia's regionally integrated economy, that stronger regions and better outcomes for the regions mean better outcomes for the nation. Now, most of you here for two reasons. The first is that your power bills have gone up. In fact, they've gone up 60% in real terms over the last 10 years. This is massively out of step with inflation. Something is going wrong. The second reason is that when you look out across your farmland, you look out across your national parks and your countryside that are being crisscrossed by transmission lines and industrial scale solar panels and wind turbines. And the reason for this is that we have broken the golden rule of engineering that has powered all of the massive breakthroughs and developments in energy over the last couple of hundred years. And that is the power of power density, which says the denser your embedded energy source, the cleaner, the cheaper, and the more productively it can be utilised and harnessed and put to work as power. It is this principle that led us from burning biofuels like timber and peat to the Industrial Revolution of coal. It is this principle that meant we moved from burning animal fats to oil and gas. And it is this principle that will power the next revolution in energy generation, which 19 of the top 20 economies in the OECD around the world are utilising or planning to utilise, which is nuclear power. And the reason that we've broken this golden rule of power density is because we have put politics before policy. Now, what do I mean by that? When you look at it from a policy angle, you have competing interests when you're designing your energy grid. First, of course, you want an energy grid that's clean. It's because we have a responsibility to steward our natural environment that we've inherited from our forebears. And we have a responsibility to steward our soils, our farmland, our crops, and our countryside that provides the food, the fibre, and the protein that our country and the world desperately needs. It means that when you design policy for an energy grid, you need to consider reliable electricity, because business and industry needs to have the confidence that they have a stagnant price and that they won't have blackouts so they can make the investments and operate their operations. We need to have secure energy when we're developing energy policy. This has never been more important than in our current time, where the geopolitical landscape is looking more dangerous than it has pretty much since the Cold War. And this is particularly important of our region when the aggressor in the Indo-Pacific is also our biggest trading partner. We need domestic energy security. And lastly, and perhaps the most important, we need cheap electricity. Cheap energy is the absolute lifeblood of a healthy and prosperous society. Cheap energy means that businesses can grow and expand. Cheap energy means that families can power their homes. And cheap energy means that communities can have confidence in their future when they're making investments and growth for their communities. But because we've put politics before policy, we've headed down the route of, rather than dense energy sources, but diffuse, expensive, large-scale renewable build-outs. We have prioritised the reduction of carbon emissions at the point of generation by any means necessary and at any cost above all of the other policy considerations. And this means now, rather than clean energy systems, we have diffuse and large-scale build-outs which have huge resource intensity in their manufacture, which have heavily toxic critical minerals and rare earths in their refinery, which means they have huge issues with the repurposing and the decommissioning, and huge disasters for our countryside, particularly when you've got hilltops which are dotted with 1,000 litre of oil turbines spinning around, which threaten bushfires. It means that we have, rather than having secure energy, we have insecure energy, where we are totally dependent upon China for our imports of batteries and solar panels, and even if we bring that manufacturing here, we are still dependent on China on the refinery of the critical minerals and rare earths in the supply chain. So rather than using our domestic fuel of coal or uranium, we've gone for the dependency on China route. We no longer have a reliable power. Rather than baseload power that chases demand, we have weather-dependent power that needs gas turbines and a fluctuating spot price, which further puts up the cost of electricity and means that businesses are no longer able to function. And we've got expensive energy, that everything I've just discussed, the large-scale build-outs, the huge system costs, the fluctuating spot prices, means that we have now some of the most expensive electricity in the OECD. Now, the reason for this is because Matt Keane and some of the other climate zealots, in the pursuit of net zero by any means necessary, have rushed through approvals of these industrial scale renewables without any community consultation. They forced AEMO's hand into designing a grid that completely removes these other considerations from play. But I am hopeful. I'm hopeful by the huge turnout in this room and the fact that there are so many bums on seats here today that actually Armidale and New England and Clare and Riverina and all these other communities around the country aren't going to go down without a fight. I have hope that you're all up for a fight. I have hope that we can actually turn some of this around before it's too late, although time is running out. And I have hope because our other wonderful speakers who I'm about to introduce feel similarly passionate about this issue and are going to lend their expertise, their grit and their will towards this wheel to push it with all of us here in this room. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. We are blessed today to be joined by Beth White, Megan Trousdale. Yep, Beth. Megan Trousdale, we've got Aidan Morrison, Dr. Robert Parker and Roger Walsh. But first up, I'd love to introduce Beth. So Beth is a lifetime resident in the New England. She is a retired teacher and a grazier in partnership with her husband Roger on a property at Ben Lomond. They've held that in the family since 1965 and were 3 grazier generations prior at Black Mountain. She's the Ben Lomond Landcare Chair and member of Ben Lomond Energy Interest Group formed in 2020, and she is also a founding member of the RED for New England. Would you please welcome Beth?
So, the REZ. What is the REZ? The Renewable Energy Zone. It was meant to be the answer to our energy requirements. Is it working or not? Is it broken? It doesn't seem to me to be working, so what does broken look like? I'm Beth White and I am from the Responsible Energy Development for New England. Why did the group Responsible Energy Development for the New England form? It's not a naysayer group, it's not a group to gossip, but it's one to sift through information, sort through the facts and seek answers to the hard questions. Our local Ben Lomond group met weekly for a whole 2 years. Then when the trusted New Zealand Forever company quit the project and left Australia, so for now we only meet monthly, just watching as that project has been on-sold 5 times since. Community groups like ours have grown up around each of the individual project proposals. New South Wales Government EO expression of interest raised 32 gigawatts of interest and the New South Wales Government got excited. They declared 8 gigawatts to be delivered to the system in the New England. Understand too that a guarantee of 8 gigawatts at all times is at least 24 gigawatts capacity must be built. No one was honest or transparent about that. But it constituted a plethora of project proposals overwhelming the New England. At a point where it was felt that there was a significant value and importance in networking, these groups each convened within their local communities around specific projects, saw the value in networking, coming together to share our experience and our resources. Responsible Energy Development for New England, which we like everyone else use an acronym, RED for New England, became an entity. The strength of RED for New England is rural community connectedness. It's important to say it slowly. Rural community connectedness. Initially caught off guard because renewable energy is good, it was unethical behaviour of scouts for the proponents and failure of governments to regulate obvious client capture in the industry that was questionable. Being told none of the electricity will be for you, it will be generated on hilltops and cleared grazing land. Some questioned the interference with the impact on their productivity. Then came accusations of NIMBY. RED for New England was to lobby. Just by way of background, in 1996, the international pressure arose from the Kyoto Protocol and to the United Nations framework, largely not enacted until 16th of February 2005 due to the complex ratification processes. 20 years ago, the first approaches were made in our area. 10 years ago, White Rock and Sapphire wind farms appeared quite under the radar. 6 years ago, Rangoon, Hills of Gold, Salisbury Solar, Winterbourne Wind, Doughboy Wind cropped up. 3 years ago, the government became desperate, rushed through a new push, and in 2021 implemented New England Renewable Energy Zone, the New England Rez. The Rez was meant to make processes easier and electricity prices cheaper. Has it achieved that, or is it broken? Broken because of the failed mode of engagement, government, proponents, hosts, communities, guidelines, commissioners. Broken because government can neither explain nor deliver on their commitments. Broken because nobody can deliver transparency about the big picture. Why the energy subsidy? Why talk of variable electricity pricing? Variable industrial rating policies? Broken because consultation looked more like dictatorship. Have you been to a forum where they are telling you how it will work, not listening to or addressing my questions? Broken? Government had no proper plan of implementation. Broken? If you can't convince them with science, you confuse them with acronyms. Scoping reports, SEERs, CCCs, EIS, LRET, SRS, CERs, NEM, CEFC, LGC, LETS and ARENA. Broken because government's failure to evolve appropriate planning. How many department names? How many guidelines? Broken because government fails to encompass or adapt to new technologies. New tech not only has new capacity, but also new implications. Broken, planning policy fails to adhere to the 2015 Paris Accord, which says, in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. Broken, are we causing economic hardship by increasing electricity prices? Or is there cheaper power for us? Broken, does planning policy breach the 2015 Paris Accord, the supposed basis of the intent, which says increasing the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change, foster climate resilience and lower greenhouse gas emissions in a manner that does not threaten food production? Broken, do planning departments choose to impinge on land used for food and fibre production? Or do we prioritise to protect fertile land for food production or not? We as RED for New England have supported each other in learning, sharing, implementing, questioning, examining, specialising, collaborating and calling out the problems, faults and flaws. It can be said that there are multiple points of fracture. It can be said, though, that we note individual landholders are beginning to understand hosting renewables is not earning easy money to drought-proof the farm. In fact, they are more aware of the need to keep communication channels open with neighbours and community. Individuals are beginning to see through the simple sign here message and can recognise the value of taking time for independent, professional, legal, accounting, insurance, management, all professional advice and scrutiny that can reveal how not to be duped. As it stands, some could, some may lose their farm through unforeseen liabilities, decommissioning and court cases. Communities are beginning to understand hosting renewables is not conducive to supporting our local RFS, SES, sport and educational goals, unlimited traffic movements, nor as simple as a few footy jumpers. Councils, we hope, are starting to understand hosting renewables offers conflicting roles and responsibilities. They are not the approving authority. They are not the decision makers, and without question must scrape for blood money in the form of benefits to balance tight budgets. However, they are beginning to understand their role is to tie in any long-term benefits after the construction stage to relieve recognisable and unforeseen liabilities. They are beginning to understand their role in protecting communities. They will have to be ahead of the game in being accountable for terms and conditions for council business like accesses, resources, waste and decommissioning. Governments, federal and state, however, have not started to understand. They have not kept up to speed with technology. They have not registered the implications, nor had vision apart from the glossy fairy tale happily ever after illusion. Meantime, the current road infrastructure cannot even see the delivery of components for wind projects. Wind and solar components are conflicted for waste, while large-scale solar projects are already being challenged by domestic solar generation. Their governments laying bare their disconnectedness. The Australian federal government and state governments support, subsidise, collude with overseas companies, coerce, all the while missing their targets. Despite the challenges on which we have sought reassurance, despite community opposition, despite poor planning governments, poor policy design from the outset, despite site selection without due scrutiny, despite land use bereft of strategic planning, despite SPIVs launched by developers without accreditation, despite dysfunction of transport system and ongoing road deterioration, despite insurance chasms, health impacts and noise impediment, despite risk to and loss of environment and biodiversity, despite ignoring hydrology or accounting for limited resources, despite risk of national security, despite failure to provide for technological change and upgraded infrastructure design, despite failure to regulate decommissioning protocols, despite absolutely no recognition of cumulative impact. Where would 19 million tonnes of road base come from for 2,000 turbines? Where would 633,000 truck and dog loads of road base come from? What about the 8.5 million solar panels you will see on the panoscope tonight? Broken at many levels: individual, community, council, state and federal governments. Broken by national impact of energy insecurity, forcing whole nation to shuffle rolling power outages. Broken by community disruption and dysfunction that will challenge the strong traditional community response, yet to come in a time of crises like flood or bushfire. Broken by government departments whose responsibility it is to plan, guide and direct the processes that fail to do just that: plan, guide and direct the processes. For instance, the size of the proposed new wind turbines have more than doubled from the time of the implementation of the RES. The subsequent increased impacts are not known. Are current planning guidelines adequate? I digress a moment. In September 2024, Boeing Starliner returned to Earth without a crew. Why? Boeing Starliner had problems with its driving force, its propulsion system, leaks and thrusters. NASA stopped everything to assess, reconsider and address the problem. Houston, we have a problem. How did Boeing address the problem? They put everything on hold in order to assess and address the problem. When our communities question and alert our governments of problems in relation to propulsion system leaks and thrusters, the mode of engagement, cumulative impact, social licence, site selection, waste management, competing resources and health, including mental health, we cried, Canberra, we have a problem. Sydney, we have a problem. We call on governments for a halt to progress to allow the assessment and adjustment of the strategy and the trajectory of the implementation of the RES. Member for Northern Tablelands, Brendan Moylan, calls for a moratorium. He said, it cannot be a free-for-all for the developers. We are the ones wearing the energy zone. He said the overall cumulative impact of these projects must be carefully and constantly scrutinised. It is infuriating that developers sign landholders to punitive confidentiality arrangements. Government must legislate against such unfair practices. Developers should not be allowed to turn neighbours against each other. Member for Barwon, Roy Butler, calls for legislated standard of consultation. In that context, note also applications are open for the New England Rez Community Reference Group. That's an opportunity, each of you, to apply. There is no respite. There is no safe place for us. There is no answer from the federal government or the state government, despite our call about system failure. We have a problem in the New England. What is the way forward? If the RES is broken, then what is the way forward? Brendan Moylan says, for the sake of our New England communities, we need to take a breath and take stock of where we are at in terms of the New England RES before this goes any further. Tonight, you will see vision of the extent of the RES projects known to date. There are whispers of more, and it's always whispers. Tonight, you will hear from people directly impacted by a fractured New England RES, from voices for the voiceless in wildlife in our environment, for those with vision and who see options. This is in no way exclusive. There's a bevy of ideas around and there are many concepts. Tune in, listen well, accept the challenge, take note. We are working for positive change. Be prepared to act after you hear our speakers. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Roger. And Roger is quite an impressive man, so bear with me for a moment. After qualifying in medicine, Dr. Walsh specialised in eye surgery, completing his postgraduate fellowships at the prestigious Bascom Palmer Eye Institute in Florida. He commenced practice on the Gold Coast in 1989 and has held positions at the Gold Coast Hospital and the RGH Veterans Hospital Greenslopes. He has served on various hospital boards and contributed to the teaching program of the Royal Australasian College of Ophthalmology. I think I said that right. On the Gold Coast, Dr. Welch founded the Vision Centre Eye Practice and the Vision Centre Day Surgery in the year 2000. And in 1996, he established the Moree Eye Service, and in 2024 opened a satellite office in Grafton. Dr. Welch co-founded the Protect Walleye movement and helped turn back the planned retreat ideology of state government. He's also an active member of Walleye Dune Care. As an environmentalist, he has published the most comprehensive gallery of wildflowers of the Uraga, have I said that right? Uraga National Park, as well as publications and photographic galleries related to sailing in the underwater world. In 2017, Dr. Welsh received recognition for his service to rural communities, environmental focus, as well as business development with an OAM. And since coming to the New England at his farm in Wongawabinda, get that one right? He has seen the need to contribute to an effective campaign against the destruction caused by renewable energy and its impacts on land and community. Would you please give a warm welcome to Roger Walsh.
Thank you, Gerard. Ladies and gentlemen, how's the volume? All right, please excuse my reference to the printed word. This is going to be a traditional speech, but it does help me manage my somewhat awkward dyslexia. Now, Mark and John have given me a very tough assignment to discuss noise and environment in 12 minutes. So my aim, therefore, is to hit the high points. Now, some of this content may be considered to be controversial, and so it should be. We're at a crossroads, and the future of Australia is at risk. Wind farms should be correctly described as wind-powered industrial electricity generating plants. For this presentation, I will continue to use as convention the term wind farm. The term renewable energy is deceptive. In physics, there is no such thing. It should be replaced with the term alternate energy. I will highlight how dangerous these plants are, if only when noise is considered. Wouldn't it make sense, if we must have them, to put them way out west, away from the human population? The turbines and blades create noise. This ranges from audible noise down into the inaudible range, called infrasonic, which is less than 20 hertz. You can hear audible noise, but you cannot hear infrasonic noise. Low frequency noise comes in between 20 hertz and 160 hertz. In nature, this can be detected when large masses are in motion, as with storms and ocean waves. The bureaucrats, I call them criminals, that wrote the Doughboy Mountain Wongwabinda Wind Farm Scoping Report have determined that you will be exposed to measurable noise, which to you will sound like grinding, whooping, hum, and thump. This sort of noise will be worse if the wind is blowing in your direction and may continue day and night, especially if the diesel motors burning fossil fuel are turned on to rotate the turbine blades when the wind does not blow. Now, the loudness of audible noise can be measured and is expressed in decibels. There's no scale used in Australia to measure inaudible noise. The Europeans are the leaders in acoustics, but we are not learning from them. Now, infrasound is a serious problem. These low-frequency, long wavelengths can penetrate through barriers and into buildings. They can cause buildings to resonate. The waves travel for miles and are difficult to shield against. They are not deflected by wind. The impact of infrasound is ignored in the scoping report despite ample literature. One source, for example, the work by Bruce Rapley, titled Conversations for a Small Planet, Volume 3, Biological Consequences of Low-Frequency Sound. Interestingly, low-frequency sound has military applications, but this has been kept from the public. In the animal kingdom, low-frequency and infrasonic vibration is used for communication. It is wide-ranging, from whales in the ocean to our friends trying to stop offshore wind farms. It's seen in elephants, cattle, and deer. And such low-frequency communication may travel over long distances. In the New England, we have observed cattle to be unsettled close to turbines, despite the glossy brochures from Arc Energy Korea Zinc showing cattle in a state of bucolic nirvana grazing under the blades. There is a sell by the developers that you can rent your farm to them, and your cattle will continue to graze contentedly, so you have a double income. You've been promised rivers of gold. But what if your cattle get sick? What if the meat is of inferior quality? How do you get on selling your, and I've applied for a patent on this, your Wongwabinda wind farm Wagyu? Now, numerous reports have addressed health impacts in humans. This is called vibroacoustic disease. Now, a common finding is sleep impairment. Sleep impairment leads to behavioral change and greater risk of cardiovascular disease. People thus afflicted by infrasonic noise have had to go underground in Germany, or actually move away, as has happened in our local community. Vibroacoustic disease is a potentially silent killer, which impacts humans of all ages. Your children are not spared. If the farmer across the road has rented to a wind farm, what could you do to protect your family? Already lawsuits are being won against the health impact of wind farms, and that war is just beginning. There will be those in the audience who want undeniable proof. My comment to them is there is enough data to know there are health problems. You don't have to prove that jumping off a building is bad for you. So why do we persist? Why is the precautionary principle ignored? No discussion about wind farm noise and vibroacoustic disease is complete without reference to the work of Dr. Mariana Alves Pereira of Portugal. She has documented injury to humans exposed to infrasonic noise. Chronic fatigue is common. In the animal kingdom, there is a greater rate of birth defects. In her laboratory research, she and others have found thickening of cell walls. Another leading scientist is Dr. Ursula Bellois-Stasek of Germany. She published a paper with a long title, but listen carefully, it was the impairment of the endothelium and disorder of microcirculation in humans and animals exposed to infrasound due to irregular mechanotransduction. Now, what does this mean? What this means is now, after decades of research, we are getting down to a cellular level with our understanding of the damaging impact of infrasonic noise. There is a type of stress reaction where cell membranes thicken. It's all there in the world literature. And bodies in this country that should be independent, like our CSIRO, the National Health and Medical Research Council, are not. Their agendas are controlled by ideology. NHMRC says there is, and I quote, a lack of high-quality evidence and investigation of possible relationships between wind farm emissions and health outcomes. And, I quote, there is currently no evidence that exposure to wind farms directly affects a person's physical or mental health. Such opinion flies in the face of world opinion. Why should our citizens be deprived in any way of their right to quiet enjoyment of their land? Thank you. Why should citizens be subject to the health risk of noise? It is completely unknown how much infrasound will blanket the New England Rez. But what we do know is that the larger the turbines, the lower the frequency they are generating, and the further the infrasonic noise will travel. Not only will farmers and their families be hit, but it is my view that the population centres of Armidale and Gyra will be saturated with infrasonic noise. Now I'd like to say a few words about loss of species biodiversity and the environmental fragility of the New England. Wongwabinda, we'll get the pronunciation right, where I farm, sits atop the Wongwabinda metamorphic complex with its mineral-laden soils. It has abundant rainfall over 900 mm a year. Now, when they arrived in the New England, the settlers introduced what they did back in England. They planted English plants, poplar trees, oaks. They farmed hoofed animals on cleared grassland. Sound simple? It's not. The way we are going with this model, in my view, may not be sustainable. I believe it is oversimplified. After all, the good Lord will bless us with sunshine and rainfall. Just fix up the soil chemistry with some single super, some lime and other goodies, and she'll be right. It's not right. Where have all the trees gone? With the need to resow pasture on a 3 or even 4 year cycle and land that craves inputs, It's clear the system is under stress, and farming in the New England could be heading for trouble. Now, this will only be worsened with wind farms. When you build, as was proposed, and is still on the cards for Wongwabinda, Doughboy Mountain, when you build a 10,000 hectare wind farm, you take out grazing land, you take out semi-arable land, you take out trees, and you take out scrub where insects live. What do you have left? Then you take out the air. You take out the air. And you use turbine blades to kill off flying creatures. What happens then? Where have the birds, the bats, the bees, and the butterflies all gone? All these are components of a complex biodiversity that actually supports arable farmland. And if that's not enough, you can introduce toxic chemicals like bisphenol A into the waterways. Infrasonic noise itself creates an immeasurable impact on the animal kingdom, and it's not just about human health. It's about the health of the entire environment. And what is the logic of destabilizing this already brittle economic and environmental model? Are we able to even afford to restore wind farmlands to fertility and production? We won't have the money to do this. Now, natural systems are resilient. If we act now, we may pull back from the edge of an impending environmental catastrophe. Species diversity. This has been destroyed by the stroke of a pen, when all it takes is sign off from 2 ministers, so all the reports, studies, consultations, abbreviations, everything that Beth, in her superb presentation, referred to, consultation with stakeholders, they don't mean a whiff. Worse, in the case of your critical state infrastructure, where the land is confiscated. And now I understand these provisions are being described or applied more generally to the REZ. The AECOM report within the Arc Energy Careers Inc. scoping report tells us what is going to happen. On page 57, there is a table that shows threatened flora and fauna. In all, there are 35 threatened flora species and 73 threatened fauna species within 25 k's of the project. The list is long. And please read on. They say, and I quote, that building and operating a wind farm may result in direct and long-term impact on the occurrence, extent, and coverage of native vegetation, including threatened species, habitat, and ecological communities, with indirect impact, including the loss of feeding, refuge, and breeding habitat for native flora. Aboriginal heritage. I have included this under biodiversity, as it is human biodiversity. The area is rich in Aboriginal heritage and predates the arrival of the settlers by thousands of years. Doughboy Mountain is the Uluru of our region. It is no wonder the Aboriginal community, the length of the Great Dividing Range, is up in arms when they see what is being done to country, and no wonder they question the poor custodianship of the land demonstrated by us whitefellas. Even a limited search by AHIMS identified the presence of 16 heritage sites within the subject area, adjacent to the Cathedral Rock National Park. But the report comments, quote, the project may cause cumulative impacts on Aboriginal heritage and destroy items or reduce access to culturally significant sites. This is a given. To summarise, 1, we threaten our model for sustainable agriculture. 2, we will destroy habitat, flora and fauna. And 3, Aboriginal heritage will be bulldozed. What do we gain? On Rapa Nui, Easter Island, they cut down the trees to build monoliths to long-forgotten gods, and we are doing the same thing. They got disease, they couldn't feed themselves, and their race died out. Thank you.
This is an overview of the New England Renewable Energy Zone. The New England Rez is designed to deliver 8 gigawatts of deliverable energy. This could be expected to be made up of 2,300 wind towers and around 19 million solar panels. This was all designed without any community consultation. EnergyCo have simply dictated the project to the community, not designed it with the community in mind. The New England is not a special renewable resource area. It was chosen using desktop mapping along with ambitious and exaggerated developer lobbying with little or no strategic planning. Much of that developer interest has now evaporated due to landholder refusal or the economic reality of developing with mountainous areas and difficult terrain. This development on densely settled agricultural land amongst high-value ecological landscape is not suitable for these areas. The New England Rez has unique concerns relating to areas of high biodiversity along the Great Dividing Range. Areas of eucalypt timber have already been challenged by old practices of clearing, bushfire and cycles of drought. What has been retained are the important ridgetop corridors of remnant vegetation extending from the gorges and national parks. Unfortunately, this is the target area for clearing to make way for project infrastructure. Without these connecting corridors of remnant vegetation, wildlife cannot survive. Massive solar projects are set out over B-cell areas or biophysical strategic agricultural land. This is a classification that applies to high-value food bowls. Solar placements are taking production away from prime agricultural areas. In the event of fire, hailstorm or other damage, these toxic panels would leach and leave this country poisoned, unable to produce food and fibre again. The Salisbury Plains consists of black basalt soils, a highly valuable farming and livestock production area, the floodplains and catchment of the Macleay River system. The wedge-tailed eagle and other protected and endangered raptors use the updrafts from the gorge to soar above the edge of the national park. This is right in the path of the proposed Winterbourne Wind project, and they face decimation if these towers are built.
So one of the big issues now for woodland birds particularly is loss of habitat and loss of connectivity. We've got about 20 or so species across the tablelands that are threatened at one level or other, and including a couple that are critically endangered, which is swift parrot and Regent honeyeater. A number of others that are also federally listed at vulnerable or endangered level, as well as quite a lot of state-listed vulnerable species. And then we've got the wetlands. We've got a number of lagoons across the tablelands that support both resident and migratory wetland birds, some of which are threatened. A lot of the migratory ones now are listed as threatened, and they're migrating from the Arctic Circle to spend our summer down here before they go back again to breed in the Northern Hemisphere. And their issues include the fact that some of them travel at night and move between wetlands on the tablelands, and they could be at risk of collisions with various things like power lines as well as fences and also, of course, turbines. And then we've got the birds of prey. We've got about 18 species of raptor across the tablelands, of which several are threatened. And I'm working particularly on 3 threatened raptors. And it's the big ones that are less agile that are more likely to come to grief in collisions with turbines. There's also the issue of collision with power lines and also even electrocution on power poles. There's quite a strike rate on wedge-tailed eagles. And of course, that's only the ones that are found, beneath the turbines as well. So it's quite likely the strike rate is higher because the birds that get injured and die off-site are not being found. And of course the gorge rims attract a lot of soaring birds of prey because of the updrafts and so on. The topography makes it a bit of a hotspot for things like eagles. And that raises the issue of putting renewables, I suppose, too close to high conservation value areas like national parks as well. I mean, there'd be a risk if it's too close to conservation areas that they would be compromising the biodiversity values of those reserves. So that's another issue with the sustainability aspect, I guess. Yeah. There seems to be some need for some way to get around this sort of conflict between renewables and biodiversity, because if it doesn't seem to me ecologically sustainable to be having an impact on on biodiversity when you're trying to combat climate change as well. So we've got to know how to deal with both. There's an extinction crisis already as well as a climate crisis.
Rejoining the overview, we travel north to the now abandoned Doughboy project, an example of a developer being confronted with the reality of difficult terrain, as well as landholders on high-value agricultural country rejecting the project on the basis of multiple neighbours being affected. Areas of koala habitat are prevalent in the Great Dividing Ranges, as are areas of other habitat for threatened species of both flora and fauna. Glossy black cockatoo, greater glider, brush-tail rock wallaby, species of bats, and many others are all impacted by the development in this fragile area. For each project, hundreds of hectares of trees, many being 100-year-old hollow-bearing trees, and various threatened species are destined to be cleared to make way for access roads, laydown areas, foundation areas for turbines and power lines. The Burralong and Warrani wind projects are noted as important koala habitat.
Koalas are now listed as endangered. The koala that we have grown to love is in a terrible position, and not enough people are standing up to ensure that humans don't wipe them from this planet. An entire species being completely eradicated due to human error is a terrifying thought. Koalas move through areas from tree to tree. They mostly do this by climbing down one tree, walking or cantering a very short distance, and climbing straight up the next tree. When koalas have excellent habitat to do this, they can move through areas safely because of how the corridor of trees has grown. When you begin to take trees out of that corridor, wildlife begins to suffer enormously. The more trees you take, the more koalas die because they have to travel huge distances to not only get to the next random tree, but to get to the next tree that is healthy, has moisture, and is suitable for that koala at that time of the season. Certain corridors have been identified as critical koala habitat, which is essentially a koala corridor that is used by many koalas extremely frequently and at all times of the year. Many of those identified areas run through various areas throughout the New England. Most notably and closest to Armidale is the Burralong area. The Burralong area, like much of the New England, has wind farms proposed for that exact land. If those projects go ahead, it will mean the end of koalas in the New England. It is not an exaggeration to say that all of their habitat will be gone and all of the koalas will be dead. Koalas have to be able to move through huge areas of connected corridors for survival. It's a death wish for them to be on the ground for very long, for many reasons. If these renewable projects get approval in the New England, there will not be any connected corridors. Koalas will be stranded. The koalas who aren't physically killed by the renewable energy workers will die soon after as a direct result of habitat loss. Koalas already have it tough enough with poor amounts of tree planting, private trees being cut down, dog attacks, vehicle strikes, chlamydia, natural deaths and more. They simply cannot handle this extreme attempt to cull them all together. This doesn't just apply to koalas, it applies to many species, many of whom are listed as critically endangered or vulnerable.
The New England has uniquely high agricultural production levels and high land values with smaller holdings relative to other res zones. These projects have a larger number of impacted neighbours, a result of poor planning. Of note, Burralong Wind Project against Armidale has 60 homes within 4 kilometres of turbines. Access is a major issue for the New England Rez. Many of the New England towns are accessed by a limited network of single-lane mountainous roads. These roads leave no space for passing of slow-travelling, oversized and overmassed trucks, leaving businesses and residents without safe or effective access. This impacts time-critical livestock delivery, transport industries, tourism commerce, courier businesses, medical services, school bus traffic and general transport, all leading to frustrated drivers and increasing the likelihood of accidents and fatalities. With a heavy reliance on aircraft for agriculture, aerial firefighting, medical care and retrieval, the New England Rez is also impacted by characteristic low cloud and fog on the top of the Dividing Range as it rolls up from the east to the higher altitudes. The eastern side of the Rez is at threat of losing these critical services if wind towers are built. Commercial operators have described these potential wind project areas as no-fly zones if there is a presence of fog, cloud or smoke from fires. As many of these areas are against National Park, the risk of fires is high, and we lose our critical, life-saving firefighting tool, aerial waterbombing. It is increasingly obvious that large-scale projects in the New England Rez are becoming less and less bankable. Site access, steep terrain, high-value biodiversity, and high-value ag production are all challenges the New England Rez faces. If this was open country, accessible by a major highway, in low production areas, it would be a different story. There is community resistance in the New England Rez for good reasons. Without considerable and ongoing subsidy, these projects are not viable in comparison to projects west of the Newell Highway. The New England Rez is a broken design, using outdated information. It is poorly located and poorly planned. We need a reset.
The Hills of Gold wind farm is 15 kilometres south of the New England Rez. It was left out of the New England Rez and the Hunter Rez. With renewables projects being proposed in and outside of renewable energy zones, do reses have any relevance? Hills of Gold Preservation Inc members naively had faith in the planning system. Even our State Member of Parliament, Kevin Anderson, said, "Trust the process." Following the launch of the New South Wales Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap in 2020, Deputy Premier John Barilaro said, "The roadmap will make sure that renewables are developed where regional communities want them." When a 2021 New England Rez registration of interest resulted in 81 potential projects put forward, totalling 34 gigawatts of energy annually, the then member for Northern Tablelands, Adam Marshall, said, "With this high level of interest, we have the luxury of supporting only the best projects that benefit the community, maintain the highest and strictest development standards, and maximise local renewable jobs and investment in the region." In reality, communities and councils have no say. We now know that independent planning commissioners can visit a site, meet with landholders and the local council, and listen to speakers at a public meeting and approve a project regardless of impacts or objections. Here are our hills of gold without turbines. And here they are. This is the photo montage that was presented to the community. Of course, you can't really see the turbines. Soil scientist Greg Chapman wrote in his Hills of Gold wind farm submission, "The proposed development is arguably the most extreme and poorly assessed risk to land and water degradation I have encountered." His submission was highly commended by Soil Science Australia New South Wales branch, but ignored by the Department of Planning and the Independent Planning Commission. Tamworth Regional Council's submission states that this development will be undeliverable without massive long-term environmental damage. In the face of such dire warnings, the Independent Planning Commission left us wondering, did they read our submissions at all? So while we see politicians at state and federal level talk about the importance of social licence and community consultation, the reality on the ground is that social licence and community consultation are impotent. This year alone, we have seen Bowmans Creek, Thunderbolt and Hills of Gold wind energy generation projects approved in the face of local majority opposition. There is a disconnect between what politicians are saying publicly about social licence and community consultation and what is actually happening with project assessments and determinations. Of the greatest concern is the experience of Hills of Gold wind farm non-compliance with visual, noise, vibration, shadow flicker and ice flow impacts for a non-associated landowner who has been burdened with voluntary land acquisition as the only mitigation measure. Even though the developer knew for 6.5 years that the landowner would not accept the impacts, the developer persisted in locating wind turbines and infrastructure on the landowner's boundary. Now the landowner must put up with the impacts or sell to the developer. Other non-associated neighbouring landowners were previously offered financial compensation for recognised impacts, but were presented with contracts that they say their solicitors advised them not to sign. Some of the most impacted neighbours have only been offered vegetation screening as mitigation, along with other landholders within 5 kilometres of turbines. The Independent Expert Advisory Panel for Energy Transition was engaged to advise on project viability. However, it did not take into account Greg Chapman's concerns about the financial and environmental risk of the project. The Department of Planning recommendation and Independent Planning Commission approval saw the inconsistent use of the 2016 and draft 2023 wind energy guidelines to reinstate 15 previously removed wind turbines for project viability. The same draft 2023 guidelines that would remove non-compliant wind turbines have been ignored. The statewide implication of Hills of Gold wind project approval is the weakening of landowners' property rights. At the New South Wales Farmers Association annual conference in July, the Tamworth branch successfully moved the following motion. New South Wales Farmers Association advocate for the state to respect and uphold landholders' dwelling entitlements and approved development applications with regards to renewables assessments, which must comply with wind, solar and transmission visual impact and noise guidelines. Yet just last week, the Australian newspaper reported the Minns government has told green industry officials eager for more details of its new wind power regime that landowners' rights are on the table. Most people in this room are aware that dwelling entitlements and approved DAs are accrued rights benefiting properties and increasing property values. They offer landowners the capacity to earn additional income through agritourism, enable farm succession by housing multiple generations of family members, and provide housing to attract and retain farm workers and their families, which is also good for our communities. These accrued rights benefiting properties and farm businesses are under threat. The second motion successfully moved by the Tamworth branch is New South Wales Farmers Association endorses the recommendations of Australian Energy Infrastructure Commissioner Andrew Dyer's review of community engagement practices. Hills of Gold Preservation Inc. participated in the review, as I'm sure many people in this room did. Hills of Gold Wind Farm is recognised as a review case study, highlighting ongoing uncertainty for the community and host landholders, and access issues including inability to use existing roads, build new roads, potential soil erosion, and changes to hydrology flows. Hills of Gold Wind Farm does not align with the recommendations of the review. The review found that 92% of landholders and community members were unhappy with consultation on renewable energy projects planned for rural and regional New South Wales. The federal government has endorsed the recommendations of the review of community engagement. The states, through the Energy and Climate Change Ministerial Council, have agreed in principle to 5 recommendations and agreed to 4 recommendations. The Energy and Climate Change Ministerial Council response to the Community Engagement Review states that community understanding and assessment of local projects is a cornerstone of this energy transformation. Ministers have recognised that large-scale renewable energy and major transmission projects are disproportionately impacting regional and rural communities, and the level and quality of engagement from both developers and government needs to improve. Hills of Gold Preservation Inc. made a submission in response to the Senate inquiry into the offshore wind industry consultation last month. Our key feedback on consultation to the federal government was that it is not enough to offer communities the opportunity to voice their concerns, in our case multiple times. The issues identified by community members, local government and state government agencies need to be heard, acknowledged and acted on, especially when they involve implications for safety, biodiversity, constructability and property rights. It is not good enough for community members, including multiple community-funded peer reviews, local government and state government agency representatives, to make the effort to respond to consultation requests, and the New South Wales Department of Planning ignores the important issues raised, its own guidelines, and recommends approval of projects regardless. In our experience, the New South Wales Department of Planning literally changed the rulebook, cherry-picking from the 2016 and draft 2023 guidelines, and did whatever it took to recommend approving the project, and the Independent Planning Commission rubber-stamped the approval. We now wait for Minister Plibersek's department to assess Hills of Gold Wind Farm as a controlled action under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. Even if approved, Hills of Gold Wind Farm may become one of the 40% of renewables projects that are approved and not built, continuing social and economic damage to the local community and the transition. Having a poorly sited project with important emissions approved by the Independent Planning Commission demonstrates a flawed New South Wales planning system. The New England Rez is broken if communities see the New South Wales legal system as their only option for appeal. This fails the environment, the community, and negatively impacts the renewables transition. It undermines the transmission for the New South Wales Department of Planning and Independent Planning Commission to recommend approval of a project with so many unresolved problems, ignoring community members and Tamworth Regional Council that has spent valuable time presenting these details to them. The psychosocial impacts of the past 6.5 years and ongoing have an unaccounted high social and economic cost. It is lost family and business time that will be never recovered. If consent authorities adopt the position to approve renewables projects, it's a waste of taxpayers' money having the facade of consultation to placate community outrage and then have those issues ignored. We have already seen New South Wales delay the requirement for community consultation committees until post-approval, removing communities' formal framework for questioning developers. In March, Victoria announced it would limit the ability of opponents to object to new wind and solar developments by forcing them to appeal to the federal court. Approving poorly sited projects will result in pushback from communities hosting renewables and exacerbate delays in realising generation and transmission in the energy transition. There are glimmers of hope as the energy industry itself points to projects in far western New South Wales that we've already heard about tonight, demonstrating greater social licence. Properties are larger, able to absorb both the benefits and impacts, and agricultural production is more marginal. Transgrid CEO Brett Redman recently mooted the possibility of a remote inland REZ. AEMO data for 2023 shows that the healthiest part of the green energy transition remains rooftop solar. If rural communities in more closely settled areas like ours are not being heard in state and federal parliaments, we need our city cousins to speak for us. Write to your state and federal members of parliament. Vote for people who will listen to you and act on your behalf. Participate in the inquiry into the impact of renewable energy zones on rural and regional communities and industries in New South Wales. Insist that the Federal Capacity Investment Scheme funds projects only with social licence. Demand land use planning for responsible siting of renewables. We all want a just transition, but not just renewables at any cost. Thank you.
It's a real privilege to be here. I live in Sydney. I grew up in Tasmania. I think this is my first time actually to come out to Armidale. So I don't know as much about this country as is what I've basically just learned tonight, and it's incredible. All the reasons that so many people have spoken about to be concerned about the res that's been proposed here aren't the reasons that I'll be speaking about. I don't know about the brilliant soils. I don't know about the narrow roads, the brilliant community that's so evident here. But it's incredible to hear about that. But the angle that I want to bring is something of a sort of a geeky boffin from the city who's looking at this energy transformation from a 30,000 foot economics and technical viability and planning perspective, and trying to see from that perspective, when I peer into the planning and the process and the justification that's used to develop these kind of renewable energy zones, what does one see? What does one see when one looks at it from that angle? So I hope that that's of interest to you to try to just zoom out and understand the broader economic rationale that has been used and the instruments that have been used in a planning and regulatory sense to push that rationale, which is an economic and environmental one, into the renewable energy zones. So I'd like to start with one of my favourite documents. Who's here heard of the CSIRO Gen Cost report? This is a common one, a popular one. So one of the things that I'd just like to highlight, I suppose, is just where the costs are claimed to lie in the overall energy scheme here. And it's very interesting that wind, for example, is proposed to cost between $66 and maybe $100, a little over $100 on its own. And to build a whole system, including wind and solar and all the transmission, all the distribution network upgrades, all the batteries, all the pumped hydro, all the firming gas-powered support on top of that, is meant to come out at an average of just about $120-something, according to CSIRO Gen Cost report. And that is something which I've done quite a bit of digging into over quite a while, and I'm sceptical that they've included a full and proper serve of all the integration costs that are required here. But the New England Rez has actually provided, I think, one very, very important case study that helps us to understand just how far out this might be that's used to produce this claim. And that, of course, is your very own Hills of Gold wind farm. The benefit of having had this push through such a difficult process and having had a new independent expert, Quango, stood up to overturn the advice of the Independent Planning Commission that said that certain turbines should be removed, is to demonstrate just how fraught the economics of building onshore wind currently is. And so basically the conclusion of the report says this cannot proceed unless it has almost the full complement of 62 turbines built, because if you took out those other 17 turbines, it would only produce power at a cost of about 122 or 126. This is already well outside the range of what Gen Cost thought was the upper bound for wind turbines. So we really can see here that there's a serious issue here, and with all the extra turbines added back in, we still only get down towards the very upper bound of what they said standalone wind might cost. So we're starting basically at a place what was thought to be the upper bound looks like it's the lower bound of these projects if we let everything get approved. So I think that's an absolutely insightful insight into the common mantra, this is the cheapest. We look at the sources of authority that say this is the cheapest, like Gen Cost, compare that to what's happening on the ground in projects such as these, and there is something of a disconnect indeed. So even accepting CSIRO's plausible range here of fully integrated firmed renewable energy, which I'm a little bit sceptical to do, I wanted to just give you a high level kind of take on what's happened in the comparison with nuclear energy, which is the obvious potential alternative to decarbonise the economy. A short while ago, CSIRO's report reported that renewable energy was 6 times cheaper, or nuclear energy was 6 times the cost. And that's because they'd chosen to cherry-pick data from a single project embodying a single small modular reactor design in the United States. That's, you can see that on the top left-hand there, that particular bar. As soon as they did, and we were very proud to be part of the pressure that was placed on them to consider this, to acknowledge that large-scale nuclear was indeed possible in Australia, that cost was brought radically down to that second dark blue bar you can see there. Now, there's a few more adjustments that we were able to make because, thankfully, at least some of these assumptions were made transparent in this case. So, acknowledging that nuclear power can last for 60 years, not 30. Acknowledging there were some fuel cost adjustments that could be made that incorporated the recent spike and pretended it never resolved. Gets you down to a much lower level, but the crucial thing to realise, they had assumed that we would only run our nuclear plants between 53 and 89% of the time, when in fact nuclear power plants typically run at 90% or above. So it's really only the very, very lowest estimate that they had considered that is plausibly what you would actually target. So with all that considered, nuclear power with just those adjustments gets you down to $130, which is in the middle of the band, if you like, for their integrated renewables, which I think actually will be shifted higher as we see things like Hills of Gold continue. Also, which we know we will, by the way, because that independent body was asked by the Planning Commission, is this just an expensive wind farm? And the answer given back very clearly was, no, we've already used the best sites. They're going to get more expensive from here. We're going to have to go to more marginal land, further from existing transmission, and that will drive costs up even further. Let's continue a little bit further on. I wanted to just mention to you briefly before I move on to the planning system. The CIS has got a website which does answer a bunch of basic questions about nuclear energy in the comparison to renewables, which are common ones in a hopefully a really easy to understand way, but well referenced and very well supported. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that if you have, you'd like to be able to answer some important questions there. Who's heard of my next most favourite document, the Integrated System Plan, or the ISP, produced by the Australian Energy Market Operator? Not so many people, that's fine. This is the big master plan, the one that has huge resources behind it, which really is the spider at the centre of the web of the whole energy transition. This is the sort of source of authority. Even GenCost refers to the methods and projections of this system. It's claimed to demonstrate that renewables are the cheapest, but only if we assume that government policies are followed, which means we must decarbonise quickly and we must eliminate any alternatives such as nuclear decarbonisation. So they also, in their plan, do not include very significant costs, including all the rooftop solar, about another $130 billion of it to go, and also, this is crucial, all the consumer-owned batteries. These are, and I quote the CEO of AEMO, indispensable to the renewable energy transition, and it's assumed that they'll be purchased by consumers and then used for the benefit of the grid. That's what the coordinated part of the storage is about. Given back to the grid at essentially no cost. So huge costs there that are simply not incorporated into the modelling of the integrated system plan. Just a couple other of my zingers about that, you wouldn't know until you look quite deeply about the integrated system plan. The software underneath it, as for most of these models, relies on perfect foresight. They assume we simply know exactly what the weather will be every half hour of the day for 25 years. That's the way that they are built. That was actually not a bad assumption when you had a system dominated by coal-fired power plants or gas power plants, which you can turn on when you want to. It's the translation of that assumption into a system where you really can't control when things operate that causes this problem. But we have a problem which we noticed here is that in their specific planning they had in their draft ISP a year that was probably La Nina, not sunny in 2045, and the year before that they proposed building 4 gigawatts of gas power just in time in the year before that. Of course, we know this is not realistic, absolutely not possible, because we don't know the weather. So the system that they have proposed in the integrated system plan, like that, could not realistically be built. We would have to build just much more backup capacity all the time so we have a reliable system. And we know this, by the way, if you look in all the right places in a consultation process that was done by the Department of Climate Change, Energy and Water, one of the modellers acknowledged that the ISP was not ever intended to be an exercise that would give you kind of, reliability requirements. It was meant for transmission planning, which I'll come to in just a moment because it's absolutely crucial. So it was intended to plan with the lines, not intended to specify exactly how much of everything would make a reliable system. And so I think that's something that, again, people should be more aware of. Now, perhaps one of the most important features of the integrated system plan that I hope everyone else will also realise is that AEMO basically has assumed that every government policy to do with carbon reductions and renewable energy will be never changed and will be immediately successful. That is the way that they have forced all their models to basically run. So there is no models now that are used to weight the cost-benefit analyses that assume we miss our 2030 targets for 82% renewables. And that's what you can see that's happened here on that right-hand panel. Just 4 years ago, the integrated system plan assumed a range of different scenarios, some very aggressive, they called it step change at the time, that never contemplated we'd approach 82% renewables by 2030. Then, of course, policies change, more ambition gets added to the pie, but now in the latest iteration, every scenario is forced to reach 82% renewables because it's been made an official government policy. And so the plan that's produced as being the plan that we are going to achieve, that we should, is actually never previously contemplated as being possible. It's simply been assumed that is what will happen. Government policy has been taken as irrevocable and inevitably successful in the Grand Master Plan here, which drives a lot of outcomes in the actual the plan that it produces and what it recommends through the cost-benefit analyses for transmission. So let's try to progress a little bit further into how this translates into some of the things that concern the renewable energy zones. This is a primary source. A bit of my style, if you can't read the fine print, don't worry, just listen to me, I'll speak to it, but I want you to see that all of what I'm taking here is from primary sources, from the actual documents here. This is where the renewable energy zone for New England is first mentioned in the integrated system plan. It's in the 2022 ISP, and you'll notice here that it's meant to be built by 2027 at the time, and it was meant to be a cost of about $1.9 billion, plus or minus 50%. That's the initial plan that was brought. There's also a little star there. See that New South Wales with a cross in it? You might not be able to see it, right? New South Wales, the cross, I've highlighted this. This says that the New England Rez is being advanced through a different regulatory framework. Normally, the integrated system plan runs complex models to pass a cost-benefit test, which then the transmission companies have to use that as a reference to say, this is in the overall economic benefit. Okay? If we didn't build this transmission, we'd have to build more expensive something else. However, for REZs, including the New South Wales plan, they have a different framework. They do not have to pass the same cost-benefit test. In fact, they're really only put into the ISP for a matter of timing, because the New South Wales government has created a process through the Electricity Investment Infrastructure Act to basically allow it to be possible for ministers to decide what happens. No stringent, holistic economic benefit test is applied as it is previously for transmission. So let's see what happens from about this point onwards. This, of course, by the way, is how the REZ looked on the map and with some of the options there that are in one of the appendices for the ISP. A few different options. The additional network capacity you'll see is approximately 3, around 1.3 for one of their options. There's a few other options, but they're around that level. They're 1 point something, some are up around 2, and the cost now is about 2 point something billion dollars in the planning. Some of the options there that are planned for that 2022 ISP. Of course, things change, apparently. When we get to the 2024 ISP, which was just published this June, we now have a very different impression of what the New England Rez looks like. It's been split into 2 parts, apparently, Part 1 and Part 2, and they're going to be completed in 2031 and 2033. So suddenly the plan that was meant to be the optimal, best, most efficient plan 2 years ago looks like there's been a dramatic shift in when it's going to be delivered and the parts in it's delivered, and there's no cost mentioned here at all. All right. In the appendices, we find some costs, of course. There's a bunch of different options here. I've just shown 2 as an example here. And now we have 1 gigawatt as one of the options. And again, there's a couple more. Some are up around a half or so. And they're expected to cost as little as $370 million and maybe up around $1 billion. So things are changing, and things are changing rapidly. And by the way, look at the map now. A totally different sequence of dots for different options that look nothing like it was previously. And they also don't look particularly closely related to what we now know from the final scoping report is the proposal that's being built. So at last, through the New South Wales process, the Energy Co process, there is some more detail, some more specific lines being drawn. There's something of a timeline here. We can't see where it gets to final construction and delivery. I can't find here in this document anywhere a total project cost. That is not clear, but we've been using a few other costs along the way in the ISP. And so you can see, of course, there are multiple different loops and spurs. That's another evolution of renewable energy zones that wasn't there 4 years or so ago when it was meant to be just a link to the area, and it was thought, I suppose, that the individual developers would pay for their own transmission. But now these spurs and loops are being added to create more different connection points, which is putting more cost on the consumers and less responsibility on the investors to make their entire business case work. And this is how this process has come about. This is what the decision making looks like. It is basically an executive order from the minister. Matt Keane signed this particular one on the 10th day of December 2021, and it simply declares that we will have this zone. There's not a detailed cost-benefit analysis that we can see and interrogate as there are for other transmission projects. In New South Wales, and it's become similar in Queensland and Victoria, they simply have to have the minister declare it, and then Energy Co can go and set about building it. And they've named here that it will be a zone of 8 gigawatts transmission capacity. How large is that difference from the previous things that we've seen that have been the options in the ISP around 1 or up to 2? And now we have a declaration from the minister that says what we need is 8. And finally, again, that was a few years ago, but now we have some details in the scoping report that says we're going to have 6 gigawatts, okay, that's going to be added by 2033, sorry. So again, the ISP is sort of miles out in all of this, and 2 gigawatts at some stage after that. Other interesting inconsistencies. The same document, literally on the next page down, says that reses around the state are going to add up to 12, of which res in New England is already 8. And by the way, we already have another 6 committed to in the neighbouring res, which is in central West Arana. So we're already sort of at and over what was thought to be a previous target. Again, you can see where I'm going here. Where is the plan? Now, I just wanted to kind of highlight here, again, to try to zoom out one step, because these reses are collectively meant to power the country, and it's hard to get a clear picture of what's working and what's not without acknowledging there are others, and they are changing too. The first cab off the rank is the Central West Arana res, so that's a little way down the road. I'm sure you guys have heard about this. And that was originally declared to be a 3 gigawatt project. But then just last year, December 2023, there was a new modification, new declaration that said, we need more capacity there, let's boost that up, let's double it to 6. Okay? Now these increases in capacity are just done by the declaration of a minister. And that means, at least for Central West Arana, which has already been assumed to be committed by the Integrated System Plan, there are no more costs in any of that optimisation that has to be considered for this. So they've doubled the capacity without those costs being incorporated in any sort of optimisation that the ISP sees. And we've also this year, just very recently, been able to find out that it's going to be about $5.45 billion is the latest estimate for the Central West Arana res, which is only going to be, in the first stage, by the way, that's only 4.5 gigawatts. So we've got over $1 billion per gigawatt for probably a slightly shorter link, actually, in the Central West Arana res. Initially, that project was thought to be around $1 billion. So the scale of the blowout is enormous. And we're seeing the same thing, by the way, in other projects such as the HumeLink transmission project, originally estimated around $1.3 billion, now got final approval at about $4.5 billion. So these estimates in the early stages are just not even close to what the full scale of the cost is likely to be. And we've done a little bit of modelling. This is from the draft 2024 ISP, and I think it's quite consistent with the final here. What's happened between these two ISPs, partly we think as a result of the minister declaring that Central West Arana can just be doubled in capacity. And that, as you can see, there has been quite a considerable increase, at least around the 2030 level, in what Central West Arana is projected to have in solar. New England has had relatively modest changes, at least according to this chart. But the story is a little bit different for wind, where you can see here the Central West Arana res has now had a massive uptick in the volume of wind that's expected to be built by 29 and 30, all right? So they're expected to have apparently 6 gigawatts of wind installed before the end of the decade. And that's a substantial substitution from what was expected to be a faster build out in the New England res just 2 years ago. So this is the scale of the changes and the swaps that are occurring between the reses at the stroke of a pen of a minister changing something. But of course, there could be a little bit more that leads to changes. Again, risking going too far into the fine print, we did discover that between 2022 and 2024 ISPs, they have uprated from Bs and Cs the quality of the wind resource they assessed in central West Tirana. So now it's got straight As. And that could be, I haven't found any other footnotes or explanation for how that's occurred, but that might be to do with the fact of the latest footnote that says that Central West Tirana Rez wind outlook exceeds the expected renewable wind potential based on geographic size and resource quality. The modelling allows basically for overbuilding beyond what they initially said was possible to build in the Rez based on paying a small premium. It's an extra $0.3 million per megawatt in their install cost. So, their optimiser, it tells them that it's okay to pay that amount more, and it is okay to pay any amount more if the government policy is forcing you to build 82% renewables by a certain date. It wouldn't matter how much more cost premium they put on that. They would pay it in the ISP because they've forced it to comply with government policies, which is to hit a certain target. So what else does this flow on to? Again, this is just the other connections to see how this particular sausage gets made. But the other projects that do have to pass cost-benefit analyses, right? Things like HumeLink and VNI West. These are the ones the ISP is meant to be the governing document for, and the ISP's approval for is absolutely critical. Right, so that project has all its benefits start to accrue just around 29-30. At the time when the reses are supposed to be absolutely jam-packed with so many gigawatts of wind and solar. Now, that's also just, of course, when Snowy Hydro 2.0 comes online. And there's also, we modelled as well, we noticed they've pulled forward one of those La Nina years just at that point as well, which also helps boost some benefits. So if the reses don't succeed in delivering all that renewable energy, the case for the other infrastructure projects as well, the cost-benefit analyses of those would also come tumbling down. It's said here, by the way, it's acknowledged in the ISP, in this appendix, it says the biggest driver for the need for HumeLink is the inclusion of several policies such as the Powering Australia plan, which is the 82% renewable target. So we wouldn't be building HumeLink today either. I'm not sure whether any of you guys have any friends who are affected by that project, but I've encountered some people who are. We wouldn't be building that on this schedule unless we had forced the model to put in all that renewable energy generation by 2030, which of course is very unlikely to occur. So let me draw to a close and give you my controversial take, if you like. Is the New England Rez broken? Probably not, because for something to be broken, that implies there was some kind of fully formed, proper, integral thing to start with. And there is just simply no case that has been what's occurred here. There's just absolutely no consistency between the integrated system plan and the New South Wales government's mandates. There have been changes from year to year that completely upend all the plans that were previously said to be optimal. And so I just think we cannot make the case that this was an optimal or well thought out or integrated system that was designed in the first place. So the RES is not broken because it was never a coherent, planned concept to begin with. Thank you very much.
Good evening to Armidale. It's lovely to be back with you. I guess we're going to have a temporary change in our lifestyle because we're looking forward to coming up here in November for probably a week where my wife will be doing a locum. So we're enjoying this area immensely. Now, tonight I'm going to talk about an intriguing problem which surrounds the issue of renewables and their viability to actually ever supply ultra-low carbon energy. And I've decided to address that with the term, are we strangled by a plastic disposable energy system? Because that appears to be what we're actually heading towards, because principally renewables require constant renewal. And we're going to talk about that in this talk. I'll take you to this cartoon that we've put here. On the left-hand side, you see a renewable energy system based on wind and solar. To make it work, as Aidan's talked about quite well preceding me, we've got to add in a lot of storage. We've got a lot to add in backup. And in fact, most systems end up needing 2 or 3 generating sources, as we've got, for example, in South Australia, that at any one time could actually power the state 100%. So we see that in South Australia quite regularly. When the wind fails, the solar can do 100%, albeit for a few hours. Or the wind comes back, it can do it 100%. And at times, gas can do it 100%. So you've got three bites of the cherry to try and get yourself into reliability. So tonight, I'll look about the incredible energy density of nuclear, why that really is a tremendous boon to our future energy systems. We'll look about the superior emissions of nuclear, and we'll look at its sustainability in comparison to renewables, and then we'll look at a few nuclear energy options for Australia. Now, I may have shown you this image one time before, and I'm putting it here again as an authority document. It comes from the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. And what they did in this document, they looked at what they call the life cycle emissions of all generators. On the left-hand side, you've got coal, okay? We know in Australia, emissions from coal are anywhere from about 1,200 grams per kilowatt hour down to maybe 750 or 800. Gas is lower. Gas is in the 600 to 450 region, okay? On the right-hand side, you may be surprised to see that renewables actually have emissions. That's the embodied emissions that come as a result of using coal or gas or diesel in the mining. And you add up what we call these scope 2 and 3 emissions, and you add them into the pot. And so it's a contested number and a difficult science to nail, but we're running with a number that comes from the United Nations of around about 12 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour for wind and about 32 for solar. Those numbers are provided they're operating at their true expected capacity. Well, look where nuclear is, okay? She's right down the bottom. She is the lowest carbon emitter we got at 6.4, all right? Everything else is higher, and nuclear is our lowest emitter. Where does that actually come from? Why? Well, as Aidan mentioned earlier, he talked about energy density. It really is vital to an energy system. I'll give you an example. When I split one uranium nucleus to give me some energy, I get 200 million electron volts. Well, that's an impressively big number, but what the hell does it mean? Well, I'll compare it with burning 1 atom of carbon. Might be from coal, might be from petrol, who knows? But it's in a hydrocarbon. I get 10 electron volts. That gives you 20 million times more coming out of the nuclear. And if you think that's big, well, just compare that with trying to get some energy out of a battery. Well, it's well and truly dwarfed. 20 million, well, it gets up to 40, 50 million. So nuclear energy density is what drives its sustainability. So the United Nations then decided, well, let's have a look at the sustainability of all the parameters that an energy generating system can have, all the impacts on our environment. Let's have a look at its climate change potential. Let's have a look at ocean acidification. Let's have a look at how damaging it is to streams, particulate matter. Let's look at the harm it may do to us in terms of toxic effects, cancer effects, all of those. They put them all together in a weighted matrix. I'll mention land use and material use as another one. And they put them all there, and not surprisingly, the fossil fuels rate fairly highly. Okay? Well, that's not news. On the right-hand side, we see that the renewables, you've got quite a drop. They're doing quite nicely compared to the fossil fuels. But there we've got, well, the very lowest is small hydro. Well, that's not available to us in this wide brown land. Then we've got nuclear, almost in level pegging with concentrated solar as our lowest total packaged sustainability generator that we can have on the grid. Nuclear has no case to answer in terms of an environmental impact. Okay, now this next issue, this next image, is where we get into a bit of a hard concept. I apologise for this ahead, but please let's run with me on it. What we've got here is a trace over 10 days in a June month of AEMO's step change model, okay? And so what we've assumed in this, we've got 10 days along the bottom, and up the left-hand vertical column, that's the amount of energy. And the wavy, heavy black line, that's the demand. That's how much electricity we need to meet with our generators. And the colours represent the types of generators. So what we've got in dark blue, that's hydro. Gas is grey. Green, that's wind. Pink, and different shades of pink, represent different types of storage. For example, pump storage or battery. The two types of yellow, well, that represents rooftop or grid scale solar. And the orange up the top, that's what we call spilled energy or curtailed energy. The reason this image is important is that if you look at the two red arrows, you see on the right-hand side arrow, sometimes that entire generation mix meets demand, maybe for 1 or 2 days, okay? On the left-hand side, when the wind came back to normal, you're spilling it. In fact, you're spilling so much energy, you are spilling or curtailing 38% of your energy in that system, okay? And down the bottom, your emissions intensity is 179 grams per carbon. Now, if you were to be chasing ultra-low emissions, you should be down around the 20 or 30 or 40. That's ultra-low emissions. That's a fail, okay? AEMO's step change model does not work in terms of getting ultra-low emissions. First point. It's also got 3 times the capacity connected gear of a nuclear scenario. And some people say, well, okay, but it'll all get better when we've got 100% renewables. You know, no gas. Well, no, because we're still trying to get that low-hanging fruit, that last bit of carbon out of the system. So when we go to 100% renewables, lo and behold, we've now got 139 grams of carbon. We've still got that embodied energy, and we're looking down the tube of about 4.5 times the capacity. And lo and behold, we're spilling 60% of the energy, okay? We're spilling more than we're consuming. This is nuts, but this is the end game. Because all we're doing right now, we're on the first rung of the ladder. We're blowing the dough now because this is the end game of where all this would lead you. Which I hope and pray is that. A return to sanity with base load nuclear, okay? We've got sitting in there, in that blue, light blue colour, that's our nuclear base load, okay? We've got about 75, 80% of nuclear sitting in there. Sure, we've put in a bit of solar for the middle of the day, and that can work with some storage. And what have we got? We've got an emissions intensity on a life cycle analysis basis of 33 grams. This does the business, okay? It really works, and we've got a very small component of connected capacity. So I lumped those 3 slides together, the previous 3, into this image, and we're only going to worry here about the second column, the highest one, the third column, the next highest, and the end column, okay? And what they represent up the top of the green box is that's the cost of electricity to you and me out of the wall, okay? And what it's telling us is that if you went down the track of 100% renewables, you'd be paying over $1 a kilowatt hour. Right? If you go to your step change, AEMO's step change, we're on about 60, 63, and you go down to a nuclear integrated system, you're down to around about the 36, about half the cost. A nuclear system will be half to 1/3 the cost, depending on how rabid you go with your amount of renewables. But the most important thing out of all of that is the red line going through it. Because the aim of all of this, why we're doing this, was in the belief that we can decarbonise the economy. Well, neither 100% renewables nor step change achieves that. It is physically impossible to decarbonise an energy system if you are reliant totally on renewables. It ain't going to happen. While ever you're making it out of coal and gas and stuff in China and in India and in Vietnam and bring it back here on a boat, you're never going to get there. And the reason being, it's because of all that embodied energy, all those embodied generators, all that redundancy. Think about it. All that solar you need to power us in winter is going to generate massive amounts of excess that's not needed in summer. Okay? That's the kind of conundrum. Even on a week-to-week basis, you saw in those images, we get tremendous differences. We also saw that wonderful video earlier tonight of what those wind turbines are going to do to this pristine environment. This is what really gets my gut, because I go camping down around our region in the Southern Highlands and we're stuck with the same sort of thing. And what I've accumulated here on this image is the hundreds of millions of tonnes of kit that's going to be built across our environments. Across the bottom, you see in green some very small columns. They're the materials that are actually going to be used in 80 years. Why did I pick 80 years? That's how long a nuclear power plant will run. Okay? So that nuclear system, I'm looking at an 80-year life. That means I've got to keep rebuilding my renewable system to match the 80 years. So how much gear am I going to build? Well, it's down there. Your 100% RE, at 80 years, you've built 380 million tonnes of stuff. And most of it's come on the boat from Vietnam or China or somewhere offshore. Most of it has not come from Australia. If we go down here to the nuclear option, over 80 years, we're on 72 million tonnes, okay? About a sixth. And we can build that stuff, 80% of that we can build here in Australia and get the GDP improvements that we ought to be getting. This is the sort of system we need for Australia, okay? This is what I'd call the nuclear integrated plan for Australia. Left-hand side, we're currently on 200 terawatt hours per year, give or take a few, all right? That's the energy we use. Right-hand side, I've taken a stab, that's in 2060, okay? I've got just over 300 terawatt hours. It's a contested number, but you've got to start with a point. I'm not going to die in the ditches over it, but that's the number we've used in our modelling. What have we got in that transition? We maintain our coal, the brown coal and the black coal, through until about 2050, okay? 2048, of that order. It drops away. We keep the same amount of solar and wind that we've currently got right through to 2060. Sure, you can rebuild it, just don't build anymore. Just don't build hills of gold and stuff like that. We've got enough, okay? That's what we've got overlaid there. We've got a small amount of gas. But look at what that red line does, the drop as we roll that nuclear out. The way it drops off in emissions, down to 27 grams carbon dioxide in 2060. This does the business. This is what we could build in Australia. We could use reactors like that, but I'll move on from those to the conclusions. So in summary, AEMO's step change scenario, or the 100% wind and solar, they will never do it. They will not be buildable in the time. They will run into flaws. We are already seeing that globally with the wind back of the German economy, where they have spent the best part of 520 billion euros trying to do it. Meanwhile, France is feeding them between 5 and 8 gigawatts of nuclear power every day as we speak. Nuclear energy is central to our lowest cost proven system. The proof is there in the other OECD nations. But it's got an amazingly small footprint. It does not need to take up your valuable wilderness areas, the ones that I and most of the people in this room feel so strongly about. We do not need to be doing this to ourselves because these things have got an incredibly small footprint. We need to learn from and collaborate with our great friends in Canada in particular, the UK, South Korea, and the USA. We have the technologies and we can do it. And we can build them. The GDP multiplier for this stuff, Aussies can build 80% of these plants. The GDP multiplier is about 4 or 5-fold. The DOE in the US has just published those sorts of results. We get a tremendous boost to our GDP if we do it. So please, let's get rid of the anti-nuclear legislation. We really have to, because our wilderness areas are depending on it, as does our economy. Thank you.
With me at the end of a very successful evening here in Armidale is Gerard Holland from the Page Research Centre and Aidan Morrison from the Centre for Independent Studies. It was first of all, I've got to say, it was a very well attended event, Aidan.
It certainly was. The room was packed, hard to get started, queue out the door, still coming in at the starting time, so a lot of people.
It's going to be a queue for the food in a minute, so we better make a move. But anyway, Gerard, what was your impression of the evening?
I think people are fired up. I was really struck by, as Aidan said, the amount of people in the room, but also the passion, the amount of whoops and cries, the anger. There was an incredible film from Stephen Nowakowski just really demonstrating the scale of these build-outs in the New England. And I think people were shocked to actually see from an aerial view, and would encourage people to dig that out. Hopefully it will be put up on YouTube in due course. But I think there's anger, but I think there's also a sense of passion and movement that a critical mass is building, and these events that are happening all over the country, that the word is getting out there and people are finally having their voice heard.
The other thing that strikes me is they're very receptive. We had a lot of very technical talks today, yours being one of them, another one from Robert Parker, but people are very receptive to the detail of this, aren't they? And I don't think they've been getting that from the government.
I think that's true. A lot of people in these communities feel, I think, sometimes a little bit intellectually isolated, that they feel like the policy and the momentum has come very much from the sort of urban environment, maybe from Canberra, but the details about how it works and how the policy has worked and how that's been justified. Sometimes I think a lot of the locals focus on the local impacts, which I hear very little about as a sort of think tank analyst, in terms of the details of what their roads are like, what their communities are like, what the hills are like here, what the wildlife is like. So I know that people are passionate and care about that, but they do want to be connected with the broad economic narrative and what is the policy and the planning process that has led this to being pushed into their communities, and renewable energy zones declared by the stroke of a pen by a minister, and why that's come about.
That was something I took out of your talk, that these renewable energy zones like this one, we're in the heart of the New England Renewable Energy Zone here, are simply just ministerial declarations. They say there will be 6 gigawatts of power, 8 gigawatts of power, and it's almost like a sort of command from heaven, isn't it? There doesn't seem to be any other reasoning involved in it.
Look, that's right. I suppose all of New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland have created their own frameworks outside of the integrated system plan and the normal regulatory investment test for transmission. So they don't have to go through the same cost-benefit analyses. It is a political decision where the minister can make a declaration. What things he considers and prioritises and how much research is done is sort of up to him, but there's no official process that sort of has to prove a certain benefit to the community or to the economy through the declaration of these renewable energy zones. And they've been declared to be extremely large in terms of the capacities they have, and even comparing them to previous documents such as the Integrated System Plan seem to be made to be larger than what's earlier been contemplated, and so driven up quite a bit. So it's really really surprising to see how that's coming about.
Yeah, I mean, I took from Gerard's, I took from Aidan's session that none of these plans are working out according to time and according to budget. We look at Snowy Hydro, it's the most obvious. There's this tunnelling process, it's bogged down there, and the cost going through the roof. But that is true of everything, and here in the renewable energy zone here in New England, the date for the start of actually producing energy is already blown out from 2028 to 2031, I think. So nothing's working in this system.
Well, I think this is the challenge where the politics has gotten ahead of sensible policy, and we're being led by ideology at the moment where we have arbitrary dates and timelines. The climate doesn't know whether it's 2031 or 2032 or 2030, but we set these arbitrary dates with the stroke of a minister's pen, and then surprise, surprise, the actual logistics of what is required to build these installations don't end up happening, whether that's because of transmission lines, whether because that's of land access issues, whether that's outrage from the community or Indigenous heritage sites. There's a whole wide range of reasons, but the really crucial thing is that currently we're on a trajectory to decommission our coal-fired power. We haven't lifted the moratorium on nuclear, so there's no new baseload coming on, and as long as we keep missing these targets, budgets keep spiralling, we can expect more expensive power, less reliable power, less secure power, and pretty much worse outcomes on every metric that you're trying to achieve.
Something says to me that we can't go on making public policy mistakes of this dimension and this cost and this importance for so long. I mean, at some point, reality has to bite.
Unfortunately, that's not the case, and I'd possibly tentatively disagree with Gerard about what is causing the slowdown in the renewable energy transition, because although there are challenges in the regulatory system and trying to get access and getting even the technology, the transformers and reactors for the transmission lines, the other thing that is not happening is final investment decision for lots of these projects. There's been, and we hear this from the locals, many things that are proposed, developed, approved, and they stall for a long time. The reality is that economics is trying to bite hard and tell us the system does not require more of these generators that can't control their output, because they tend to oversupply at the wrong times when the price is low. A lot of these projects can't get the sort of offtake agreements that they would require to be funded by the market. However, the policy of the federal government is to create the capacity investment scheme that underwrites that and says, we will pay what is required. We will promise you a floor in your revenues, whatever is required to ensure that you're built. So we're creating the mechanisms to basically delay that reckoning with reality and the economic reality that is already actually causing a stalling of the final investment decisions for many of these projects.
Chris Bowen, if he ever comes out here, tends to sort of fly in, fly out, do his photo opportunity. I don't think he'd realise quite the extent of the community anger, would he?
Well, he doesn't live close to one of these installations, and this is the real challenge when you have metropolitan decision makers who are making decisions on behalf of regional communities without any consultation whatsoever. And I mean, the same thing happened with Matt Keane. With the stroke of a pen, no consultation, developers were said, have at it, and the community was furious. And I think you are only going to see this anger continue to build, because as more transmission lines go in, as more wind turbines go up, more and more people become impacted and affected, be it their land, be it the sound that we heard from Roger and how that's causing real problems for people with that low frequency noise, or be it bushfire risk. And this is the other big challenge. We roughly have a bushfire season every 10 years in this country. The last major one was in 2019. When the next one comes around, we're going to have hill ranges and mountaintops dotted with 1,000 litres of oil in big spinning turbines that also have a downstream drying effect, which will just create an absolute tinderbox that aerial firefighters can't get close to because of the wind blades and because of the dangers with all of that as well. So there's a real serious crisis here, and I just hope and pray that these metropolitan policymakers begin to listen and change tack before we have one of these catastrophic fire seasons that are now starting to be predicted by the RFS and others.
Look, it probably wasn't a representative audience in terms of the entire population. These are people that have been affected by these renewable energy projects, so they've read a lot, they've got into the detail, but you have to say in terms of the nuclear argument, it's won if you listen to this room.
I mean, that's right. We had a couple of questions at the end of the day. No one asking a skeptical question. Everyone's trying to more or less sort of, tell us how good it is. So it seems like there's not a lot of resistance in these sorts of communities, at least. So yeah,
the logic just stands out at you, doesn't it? When you project forward, as Robert Parker did, where we're going with this current system, which is towards a still quite a polluting system for a long time, very expensive. The logic of nuclear just stares out there.
I think so. I think it's the only credible way we can get to a truly reliable, economically effective system. We've never seen renewable energy support a whole system to anything like the degree that's being proposed that must happen in the next 5 years. So it seems like if we want to decarbonise and actually have an economy that has reliable, low-cost energy, nuclear is the only option, I think.
And we're winning the politics?
Look, we've won it out in the bush, and that's the real challenge. Is currently our politics is being held hostage by a couple of green and a couple of teal electorates, and they're the most disconnected from the realities of this transition. They're wealthier households, so they're the least impacted by increased power prices. The lower socioeconomic status you are, the more increased energy impacts your household budget. But they're also far away from the installations. They're not seeing the koala habitat being destroyed. They're not experiencing the low frequency sound. They're not seeing these huge kilometres of concrete jungles and infrastructure that's being put on in national parks and on our mountain ranges. So that's the real challenge, is to encourage metropolitan people to come out, listen to these stories. And that's why I think the work that Stephen's been doing is so powerful, to actually visualise what this means. And in lots of ways that the climate movement was built on images such as, the polar bear on melting ice caps, and those really evocative kind of scenes that really emotionally motivate you to do something about this challenge. And I think what we need to do is start communicating how destructive this is for our environment, and begin to communicate that actually we are destroying environment, we're destroying natural habitat in service of the climate, and it's just not sustainable, and it can't continue.
Well, gentlemen, the queue at the Armidale Bowls Club, I think the bistro is increasing, so I can't keep you much longer, but Aidan Morrison, thank you for joining me. Gerard, Holland, thank you. And
Nick, thank you.
Join us again soon on Reality Bites, I hope.
Always a pleasure, Nick. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.